The best thing I did in my garden this year was grow my own tea. And you guys seem to really like it too. Actually, the 2 tea garden planting videos that I filmed for you guys this year are some of the top performing videos on the channel. So I thought it would be fun to actually go and do a deep dive Q&A because I get a lot of frequently asked questions about the tea garden specifically, growing your own tea, storing it, and actually using it. And since we're gonna be diving more into herbalism and tea blends over the winter months, I thought this would be kind of a good place to start to kind of give you a framework to build off of. If you have additional questions, you can ask them down in the comments down below. And this garden was totally spontaneous. I didn't plan to do this. It wasn't part of my initial spreadsheet draw up that I did back in January. I actually got to planting time around April and May, and I had these 3 beds that I had a plan for, and then things shifted, things pivoted. As soon as I got these beds built, I realized that they had this perfect little ledge on them to rest your drink on. And I thought, if I could rest my morning cup of tea that I enjoy in the garden on these ledges, how can I make this even more full circle? And that was when I had the idea to devote those beds solely to plants that I could use for brewing my own tea. Now, I know I keep saying tea. Technically, tea can only come from the tea plant, which I also have a whole video about how to grow the tea plant, Camellia sinensis. If you want to check that out, I'll link it here for you. Technically, what we're brewing are herbal teas or tisanes. So we used a lot of different savory and sweet herbs for our tea blends in the garden. And the very first question on our list is, what was your favorite thing that you grew in the tea garden this year? It's actually something that I had never grown before, and now I feel like I don't know how I went so long without it. Sometimes you just find a plant that you're like, where have you been all of my life? And for me that year, it was lemon verbena. I know this is a pretty popular one. It's not perennial in my zone, and I tend to avoid things that aren't perennial in my garden, especially when they're such large plants, and herbs in general are just more expensive to buy as starts, and I don't typically start them from seed because buying a whole pack of seed to grow one single plant just has never felt worth it to me. Plus, herbs just take a really long time to mature, so I like to get them as starts. I got the lemon verbena from a local nursery. The smell of this plant is literally like perfume. You guys saw me ranting and raving about it all summer long. Every time I walked by it, I would literally just give it a big hug because it was the best smelling thing ever. You can harvest whole stems from lemon verbena or individual leaves. I did the whole stems to dry it, and fresh leaves I just steeped right away individually. But the more that you kind of prune it, the bushier it will get. I did not do a great job of pruning mine this year, so next year I definitely want to be more on top of that. It makes really tiny little flowers, and it seemed to attract a lot of the pollinators, which the tea garden in general attracted a lot of pollinators. It really, I think, helped with kind of managing the pests in the entire garden overall, which was my favorite thing about it. Next question was, what was your least favorite thing that you grew? This is a little bit tough. I really didn't have anything that I was like, oh my God, I'm never gonna grow this again. Like herbs and flowers in general, they don't have a lot of the same pest problems and pressures on them with diseases that make them harder to grow. I feel like if I had to pick something, I would say the violas. I love violas. They're very easy to grow. The only downside to them is that they tend to die off for a good portion of the season and then come back when things get cooler. So to me, that's kind of a downside, because overall, one of the things that I loved about the tea garden was it just kept pumping stuff out all season long. I just planted it once. I didn't have to do succession planting. So it was really low maintenance in that way, and the violas kind of let me down because I want them all season long. I will still continue to grow them because I just think they're so beautiful. I accidentally discovered a new variety this year that I tried to save some seeds from. I found it as a start on a clearance rack at the hardware store, and I didn't really use the violas for tea. I tend to just use them to decorate desserts or salads as a garnish. They're not a big one that I use for tea in general. How do you dry your herbs? There's so many different ways that you can do this. I did do a whole deep dive video going into exactly how I dry my herbs. The biggest considerations, no matter what method you're choosing, are to pick something where you can have really good airflow around the plants and really good control over temperature and humidity, because moisture and cool air are not going to be doing you any favors. The warmer and drier it is, the faster those herbs are going to dehydrate, and the less likely it is that you're going to have issues with mold developing in the process. So you do want to give your herbs a quick rinse before you dry them. Making sure that the herbs are not soaking wet before you tie them into bundles will help with keeping any mold away. For larger woody stemmed plants like the lemon verbena and the pineapple sage, I will cut that as stems, bundle it together in bunches about 1 inch to 1.5 inches thick, and tie those and hang them upside down in a cool, dark place. If it's something that's gonna take a little bit longer to dry, like sage, I may put that bundle inside of a paper bag to protect it from gathering dust. Especially with sage, it has leaves that I feel like just are very soft and fluffy, and they have a tendency to hold on to dust. So that's really important to keep in mind, is like what kind of herb you're actually drying. When it comes to things like hibiscus flowers, I was deconstructing those and drying them flat on a bamboo tray. I have a beautiful bamboo herb drying rack that I have been obsessed with all season. And then once those herbs are dry, keeping them stored in a cool, dry place, preferably in an airtight glass container, like these mason jars here that I've been working with. How do you steep them and what tools do you use? Steeping fresh herbs is really different from steeping dried herbs. And I had a lot of people comment on the videos that I did where I was steeping fresh herbs being like, you didn't steep it long enough, it's clear. And it turns out that a lot of plants, when you brew them fresh, they don't really change the color of the water that you're brewing as much. At least it doesn't come up on camera. But you do need to steep them for a lot longer than just like your typical tea bag of green or black tea. So an herbal tea can steep for like 8 to 10 minutes, sometimes even longer, depending on what effect you're going for and how potent you want it to be. And a lot of times when you're brewing it fresh, it's more aromatic than anything else. It has a much more mild flavor profile. And to me, that was more just about the ritual of being able to do it in the garden, in the moment, versus like having it dried was more for the colder months when I didn't have access to it fresh. Dried herbs, you're doing about a teaspoon to a tablespoon of dried herbs per 8 ounces of water. You really don't need much. And you want to steep them generally at a fairly low temperature. I like to steep it around 180. But the most important thing when you're steeping herbs for medicinal purposes especially is to keep in mind that the steam rising out of that hot water as it's steeping has a lot of the beneficial compounds that you want in it. So this is why you'll see tea sets that have like a lid on them. And so I will actually put a saucer over whatever I'm steeping in if it doesn't have a lid to kind of trap that steam in so I don't lose those medicinal benefits. Where did you get that mug? So I believe this is in reference to the potting mug that I have. I will link that for you guys below. I think it's an excellent gift for anybody who's into plants, to be honest. I'm not a big novelty mug person. Generally, I like hand-thrown pottery, but this one's really fun. It's really cute and it's a good size too, and it's comfortable in your hand. Where did you get that cabinet? So the apothecary cabinet actually came from my aunt. It's an antique from the 1800s. I think it's a jam or jelly cabinet that people used to store like canned goods in. So it's pretty one of a kind. I've looked up recently like what it might cost to get another one, and it's pretty exorbitant. Like, they are not cheap. They're very sought after. I don't really love the color of mine, and I don't think it's like original paint. I just don't think the red goes with like anything in my greenhouse or where I had it in my house to begin with. But I'm also the kind of person who can never repaint like old furniture. Like I cry whenever I see like mid-century furniture that's been painted and it didn't have to be. So right now it is what it is. I love the texture of it. I love the character that it adds. And it's pretty functional. What are the easiest tea plants to grow for beginners? Honestly, like I said, the tea garden in general was super low maintenance. I do have a list of everything that you can grow in a tea garden available in a downloadable format, which I will link for you guys below as a free download for my community. There were none in my garden that I was like, oh God, I wouldn't recommend growing this to a beginner. I think, you know, grow what you're most excited to grow. And I always recommend that first. Like, don't grow something that you're like, oh, that doesn't sound good. Like, you want to be excited to try it and eat it. Hibiscus is a really satisfying one because it's beautiful, it has lots of blooms, and it makes an incredible tea. How do I protect my tea garden from pests and diseases? I honestly didn't. I don't think you need to, because so many of these things, like think about nasturtiums and calendula, for example. I had those in every single bed. Those are gonna deter 80 to 90% of the things that would be munching. The only thing that I did have problems with were Japanese beetles at one point, but even like when they were decimating other areas of my garden, they really didn't come after the tea garden in the same way that they came after everything else. And I do believe that's because everything in there is so aromatic, it's naturally deterrent. So if you're looking to do a low maintenance garden in general and just start to learn about plants, I think that a tea garden is a really great place to start. I don't really use chemicals in any part of my garden. I use integrated pest management, which is a lot of companion planting. And if you guys want to learn more about companion planting, let me know and I can do a separate video on that. How do you decide what your tea blends are going to be? So this is very highly personal and individualized, right? Like for me, my focuses are generally on stress, pain and fatigue. So I try to look for herbs that do well for those particular issues of mine, but also taste good. So if I have to use an herb in a blend that doesn't taste good, I'll add something like hibiscus to kind of mask that flavor a little bit. And it's really just like an art form more than anything else. It's not an exact science. You can kind of play around with it. It's a really fun way to experiment, very like low pressure. I'm scared to do something wrong. How do you know these plants are safe to eat? So there are a couple of plants that I had in the tea garden that you do have to be a little bit more careful with. One in particular that comes to mind that I know we've talked about a little bit already in past videos is marigolds. So there's only a couple varieties of marigolds that are known to be safe to eat. And a lot of times we're getting marigolds from starts in the nursery. You don't really know what the specific variety is. So if you're gonna grow marigolds to eat, the best thing to do is to start it from seeds so you know exactly what variety you're growing. But there is also this just kind of overarching fear, I think, of eating plants from a garden in general, that unless it's like literally a pepper or a tomato or a cucumber and you know exactly what it is. I know people are also afraid of like eating wild mushrooms. There's a lot of like paranoia and fear that's been kind of ingrained in us. And I think this is mostly a uniquely American problem, to be honest, that we've kind of been conditioned not to see that there's food all around us, which is a much bigger conversation. But I know, for example, whenever I've talked about mushrooms online, and I see people worrying about the safety, I've had people from other countries be like, this is just a part of our culture here. Like, it's so shocking to me that people are so scared. So I would encourage you to really try to unpack why you're afraid to eat plants from your garden. It doesn't need to be this mysterious thing. Like, yes, I can give you a list of tea plants, but if you're scared to start, like, I would recommend maybe just pulling 3 off that list and sitting down for an hour and doing some research into those plants and their safety and efficacy and what they're used for. But this is where modern medicine came from. Like, plants inspired a lot of the things that Western medicine uses today, and plants have been used in traditional cultures for literally centuries to help people. None of the ones on my list are risky or unsafe for most people. Of course, anytime you're eating anything new, you should be kind of doing your own research and figuring out if it's safe for you and whatever conditions you might have. But I do think it's definitely worth unpacking why you're afraid of these things, if it's something that's just been conditioned into you, or if it's just that it's unknown and it's new. Empowering yourself with information will probably make you feel a lot better. What are the best books to learn more about herbalism, herbal teas? I'll put a list for you guys down below. This kind of ties into the next question, which is, do you have any other herbalism resources? I pretty much use just a handful of books, and then online, I do have another resource for like online courses that you can take to learn more about herbalism, which I'll link for you down below as well. But definitely keep in mind when you're choosing what resources to work from, like the different cultural backgrounds that these people may or may not have. Like, there is a tendency in herbalism in general for it to end up being kind of whitewashed. A lot of the culture has been stripped out of it, and there is so much history in indigenous communities that is important to acknowledge whenever we're practicing with herbs and plants. So a lot of the herbalism that I lean into is more Celtic in nature because of my Irish background and heritage. But learning about the history of herbalism is just as important as learning which herbs do what. Do you think you will grow another tea garden next year? It's definitely my plan to always have a tea garden going. I honestly don't even think I'm gonna make a lot of changes to my tea garden next year. Having the lemon verbena in a contained raised bed was a little bit difficult because it wants to be so big. So I don't really know. I might not put the larger kind of bushier tea plants in there next year, but honestly, I didn't mind that either. Kind of having like a centerpiece plant that was larger in the middle. I did the lemon verbena in one, the hibiscus in another, and the pineapple sage in the third one, and then kind of sprinkling in the smaller stuff all around that. It did work. Like, it didn't choke out any of the smaller things. They were able to kind of have enough root depth that it wasn't an issue in these beds. The beds themselves are great because they're at least like, you can change the depth of the soil, but I made it as deep as possible. So that was like 15 inches of soil, and they were also really easy to assemble. I get a lot of questions about my raised beds because I have like 3 different styles that I use and test out, and these ones are my favorite because they're the most affordable for what you get, and they seem like they're going to last the longest, and most importantly to me, they were easy to assemble, which I feel like is really underrated. Like, yeah, you only have to do it once, but if you can't do it at all because of a physical limitation, then what's even the point? These go together in like 5 or 10 minutes. You don't need any tools, there's no screws, and you can do it by yourself. So I think they're probably the best beds out there for low maintenance gardening. If you're trying to do elevated raised beds like I have to kind of limit your bending and kneeling for chronic pain reasons, or if you're in an area where you can't grow in the ground for some other reason. I hope this was helpful, but let me know if you have any other questions about growing a tea garden down in the comments. Make sure you hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. Thanks for gardening with me, and I'll see you next time.